Good morning. This is Tom Dorr. I'm the President and CEO of the U.S. Grains Council. I'd like to welcome all of you to this event at which we are preparing to provide you the results of our 15th annual U.S. Grains Council China Corn Harvest Tour, which culminates in a production estimate put together by a number of the participants on the tour. In the room with me here today are my Vice President Membership and Operations for the U.S. Grains Council, Tom Slate, who was on the tour; Rebecca Bratter, the Vice President of International Operations; Michael Callahan, who's our Senior Director of International Operations, specifically involved with China; and Eric Erickson, our Special Assistant for Planning, Analysis, and Programs. On the phone, we have with us today Kevin Remp, who is on our Asia Advisory Team, representing the Iowa Corn Promotion Board. Mr. Remp also traveled on the tour in the early part of September, so he is going to share with you part of his observations prior to getting into the estimates. We also have with us Don Hutchins. Don is the Executive Director for the Nebraska Corn Board, and he too recently represented his colleagues within the state corn checkoff executive group with a group of them that also participated in the tour just in the last week and a half. Also from his sector and his colleagues participating on this tour were the execs from Iowa, Craig Floss, Laura Noth from Kentucky, and Jerry White from Kansas Corn. Before I turn it over to Mr. Remp and Mr. Hutchins for an overview of the tour, let me give you first just a bit of background on why this tour receives the attention it does. Tracking production, tracking the ending stocks, and even trying to assess a yield in China historically has been a challenge. As we all know, the Chinese government historically has not been transparent in its systems. It is now in the process of trying to, in my view, make its systems more transparent, but that still means that this tour is quite essential if we are to assess the opportunities in that market. Our process, that developed by the U.S. Grains Council, has evolved over these 15 years, and we do believe it is reasonably reliable. We hope you find this information useful. We will open it up for questions at the end. But before I turn it over to Mr. Remp, I would like to make just a few quick housekeeping announcements. There will be several ways to ask questions on the webinar system, and you can use the raise hand feature on the webinar toolbar, which will tell Ms. Caro to unmute your phone, but you can also use the question feature and type in a question. We will be sure that all questions are answered before we discontinue the call. And with that, I would turn it over to Mr. Remp. Kevin, are you on and are you ready to go?
Yes, I am, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as Tom mentioned, this is the 15th annual China Corn Harvest Tour, and I had the privilege to participate in it and to be the representative for the U.S. corn farmer. The Council has been conducting this tour since 1996, at a time when it was only crop information on China being collected outside the government. This tour consists of two major surveys in the North China Plain area and in the Northeast China area. These two areas represent 71% of China's corn production, and the remaining 30% is dispersed across the countryside, so that it's very difficult to take a survey in that area. The groups were made up of grain traders, the feed industry, both U.S. and China analysts, the U.S. Embassy, and U.S. corn producers. We traveled throughout China the early month of September in the Northern Plains area and later on in September in the Northeast area. And during that time, more than 300 samples were taken in the 7 major corn growing areas. Go to the next slide here, please. This is a map of China's major corn growing areas and minor. You can see in the dark shaded areas are the major areas, and the area I was in would have been the middle area on the slide of the Shandong province, and the Hebei province, and that is called the Northern Plains area. And then the northeast would be the Jilin and the Heilongjiang. Excuse my Chinese if, like I say, I don't pronounce these exactly right, but the North China Plain area is approximately 30% acreage in those provinces, adding along with Henan. And this region is similar to the Western Plains of the United States. And when I looked at it earlier prior to going, I just kind of crossed it over from the globe, and it was kind of like a central Missouri area. So that was give you an idea of, it was a longer growing season, but a lot of the sampling we were doing in that area was a double cropped corn after winter wheat. So they were using their shorter season hybrids, but it was planted probably around the 1st of June. The Northeast China accounts for approximately 37% of the acreage and includes the provinces of Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning, and then the Inner Mongolia. And this region is roughly similar to the northern Midwest. So when I looked at it earlier too, it'd be like a northern Iowa to central Minnesota area. Both of these tours included about 3 to 4 groups, and we were in the field about 4 to 5 days. And like I said before, I was in the Shandong area, and it was what I noticed in that, as we got further inland, the soils became a little bit better, and that was very evident on our samples that we were taking. And as we go through this, we determined that China will produce a bumper crop this year with a production estimate of 167 million metric tons, or roughly 6.6 billion bushels. This is considering the projected corn harvest area of 76.35 million acres, which comes out to roughly almost 86 bushel an acre. And now I will turn it over to Don Hutchins, and he will discuss how yield and production area is determined. Don?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Kevin. The process I'm going to explain is identical to the way that we would estimate yield potential in our own corn harvest tours. As Kevin noted, groups travel through the 7 major growing areas to determine yield, acres, and production. Groups average about 10 to 12 samples per day. In order to estimate yield, groups measure stalk spacings, row spacings, ears per plant, the number of kernels per ear, maturity, and specific problems including lodging, pest presence, weed pressure, or mold. Corn samples are collected from each sample location and are tested for moisture and density. Between 25 and 40% of the sample sites are located by GPS, and the rest are identified by map waypoints. For next year, we would suggest that using GPS on all the sites and locations. In addition to collecting samples at most stops, teams will meet and talk with farmers to identify relative crop quality compared to the previous years. Yield numbers are evaluated based on the samples. A summary of the conversations with the farmers and the analysts of the members of the groups. An assessment of the sample is provided for the review and evaluation, such as identifying the number of samples, plants per hectare, ears per hectare, ratio of ears to plants, and average kernel per ear, and estimated average yields. Since samples for the year have not been tested, sample weights are used for the previous year. The participants discuss farmer comments and independent assessments of the crop and come to a consensus on numbers with respect to yield and area. Production is then calculated based on the yield and production area. I have to admit, these farmer visits were very revealing. We did have the opportunity, the 4 state execs, to visit with 3 very different producers. A 55-year-old man that had 3 hectares and shared information about his crop. His crop was hand harvested at a cost of about 2,200 yuan per hectare. Then we had the delightful experience to meet a 78-year-old woman who had her daughter's crop harvested and piled by her home, and she now adorns a Kansas corn cap. A younger producer that was having his crop mechanically harvested at a cost of about 1,000 yuan per hectare, using a John Deere tractor and a 2-row picker. Next slide, the estimates for growing area start with a report from provincial and national statistics bureaus. It is Chinese practice that these numbers may be adjusted either up or down with policy objectives in mind. As a result, official changes in growing area do not necessarily reflect changes in actual production area, and actual production area is really difficult to ascertain. That is one of the key reasons the Council began doing an independent survey 15 years ago. It was interesting, some Chinese grain traders complained about the accuracy of U.S. crop statistics, but were very quick to admit it was far better than any they had. So the value of the Council data collection is far better than whatever has existed before. The Corn Tour participants estimate production area based on official government statistics, independent analysts, numbers and discussions with provincial grain bureaus and government officials. Only growing area is tracked. There is no separate harvest area and little abandoned area, as the cost of harvesting generally only includes labor, since between 60 and 80% of the crop is harvested by hand. We did discuss with area farmers the fact that there may be some cross loss with mechanical harvesting versus hand harvesting. On the last day of the tour, next slide shows the group that was trying to come up with numbers, and the members of all the Corn Tour groups review and evaluate estimated growing area and yield numbers. This process allowed everyone to debate how each provincial crop looked compared to the previous years, and probably the toughest debate was on planted acres, since it's very difficult to know from any government statistics what those planted acres might be. Next slide. Pictured here is a Chinese government reserve harvest facility, which you can see is empty. Our area of northeast China was just getting into the 2011 harvest. What storage we did see was corn piled at individual farm locations, and local pricing for the corn was very interesting. The numbers we heard was around $10 per bushel. In spite of the current economic pressures, there is evidence of strong and increasing demand for higher quality protein diets. And with a population of 1.2+ billion people and changing income levels, you can see the demand for higher quality protein is going to continue. The 5 to 6 year trend shows that demand exceeds production. All around, government, private analysts, and the Council say this is a good crop, and by everything we saw, we concur. The Chinese typically are inclined to maintain a higher level of stocks, roughly 25%, and the Council believes the 2011 production will account for 14 to 16% ending stocks. Therefore, China will need to import to rebuild those carry-out stocks levels. Outside of considerable lodging, the 2011 crop impressed our state exec group. You could see the obvious hybrids that could not hold up to wind and excessive rain, but yield loss will not occur if it was hand harvested. I'll turn it back over to Tom, but on behalf of the 4 state execs of Craig Floss from Iowa, Laura Noth of Kentucky, and Jerry White of Kansas, I do want to say thanks to USDA, to the U.S. Grains Council, and our respective state boards of Nebraska, Kansas, Kentucky, and Iowa for allowing us this unique opportunity as state execs to compare what we do in the states to what the Council and the independent analysts are doing in China. So Tom, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Don and Kevin as well. We really do appreciate your assistance and your involvement in this. It does provide a level of validation that we think is essential to making certain that our numbers are at least reasonably accurate and well respected. As Kevin has already indicated, the Council estimates a bumper corn crop this year in China with a total production of approximately 167 million metric tons, or 6.6 billion bushels. Now, this would be a record production based on our long-term trend assessment of their crop size. Those of you who have analyzed this closely realize that China, the government itself, is estimating a yield of 182 million metric tons. Therefore, there is some significant difference here. However, their number would be a record yield as well. So, from that standpoint, in anyone's vernacular, they are embarked on harvesting a record crop. We believe that this has been taken off of 30.9 million hectares, or roughly 76.35 million acres. These numbers and acres that have been collected, we have worked with a number of private Chinese analysts as well, and a lot of these numbers are derived from discussions with provincial leaders, and we believe that this gives them a better level of accuracy than perhaps what we have historically tended to receive from the federal government itself. The yield obviously translates to about 5.4 tons per hectare, or as Kevin said, about 86 bushels per acre. Our calculations, if you go to the next slide, our calculations and estimates suggest that domestic corn production in China has exceeded domestic use 6 of the last 7 years. And this is clearly why China has emerged as a buyer of corn, and this has, I think, quite appropriately reflects why the world is struggling trying to get their arms around what exactly is going to be the long-term demand over there. We all concur generally that the domestic use in 2010 and 11 was about 163.5 million metric tons. We believe in 2011-12 it will be approximately 170 million metric tons. If our production estimates are correct, they will once again exceed their demand by approximately 3.5 million metric tons. Their demand will exceed their production. We believe that over the last 7 years, that China's cumulative consumption above our estimated production of the Chinese crop amounts to approximately 40.5 million metric tons. And if that's the case, and if our production estimates are close relative to what the China government says they have produced, we also believe that their production has exceeded our production over that same period of time by approximately 97.5 million metric tons. So, with that, I would open it up. Excuse me, we have one more chart on here, and this is the chart that I just gave you, but you can see that the China government production estimate for the 2011-12 crop is 182.5 million metric tons. The U.S. Grains Council is 166.6. The gray area is their domestic consumption, which we believe in 2011-12 will approximate 170 million metric tons, or they will again exceed their production with demand by about 3.5 million metric tons. So with that, we would open it up for questions, and Mari, I would turn it back to you to manage this.
So there's 2 ways to ask a question. You can use the raise hand feature on the webinar, or you can manually type them in. When you raise your hand, I will unmute your phone and allow you to ask the question. The first question comes in from Todd Gleason.
Unmuted.
Todd, your phone is now unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
We have been suggesting, based on our best assessments, that the demand for China corn in the coming crop year, the year beginning October 1 through, quite honestly, it gets a little bit complicated, Todd, probably through December of 2012, is going to be between 5 and 10 million metric tons. We all know that there were approximately 5 million metric tons that were listed for sale by USDA, but to unreported destinations. We believe that a good share of that is China corn, and we believe that the estimated carryover, according to our calculations, is more like 24 million metric tons, and we believe that their focus is somewhere between 35 and 40 million metric tons. So we think an estimate of their import demand from all markets around the world will be between 5 and 10 million metric tons. Yes, and excuse me, that would be 200 to 400 million bushels. I would actually turn that over to Mr. Callahan, who has been involved in that for some time. Michael, do you have an assessment?
Well, in terms of yield, they seem to be staying fairly constant. There have been, in some of our previous calculations, I think a couple of years ago, we estimated that the yield could have been closer to 89 to 90 bushel to the acre, but they don't. These yields don't seem to be going up the way that one might expect them to, which seems to suggest that while there is a certain amount of new agronomic practices being put in place and maybe increased plantings per acre, but looking at the country across the board, or the crop in general, you probably don't see all of these, very many of these improvements being put in place.
We also would point out, Mr. Gleason, that I believe the average plant population of all the samples taken this year were 23,000 plants per acre, and they are using, by and large, older but yet single cross hybrids. So those yields are probably reasonable.
And that was Mike Callahan, just once again, Senior Director for International Operations. Last name is spelled Callahan. Well, if you have the need to contact the Grains Council, please contact me. My email address is on the screen here. The webinar, copy of the webinar can be found later today on our website. There's also photos being uploaded on our Flickr account. That's flickr.com/USGC. And as always, feel free to contact me with additional questions. Thank you for joining us.